Briefly, first let me say how pleased I am to introduce this panel and these papers. We have here presenting today first an old friend of the Ciceronian Society, who I believe I first met almost 10 years ago at one of our conferences at Mount St. Mary's. Ethan Alexander Davey has an MPhil in Russian Studies from Cambridge University and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has long shown his scholarly courage by offering dissent from the demotic spirit of our age, and in publication, this took the form of co-editing the volume Aristocratic Souls in Democratic Times. And there's a second installment of that coming, right? There is. And forthcoming, there's a second installment of those essays. From Lexington again? From Lexington. Very good, from Lexington again. And he will present on W.H. Reel's Cure for Modernity. Second, John Grove of the Liberty Fund demonstrated his love and friendship for the Ciceronian Society last spring with his wonderfully affirming feature on our work, which was published in Law and Liberty, where he is managing editor. That was last spring, right? Yeah. He holds a PhD in political theory from Northern Illinois University. His book, John C. Calhoun's Theory of Republicanism, was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2016. Finally, I have the honor of introducing the inaugural awardee of the William G. Batchelder III Memorial Award for the Study of Place. First, a word on William G. Batchelder III, my late father, who passed away just before the conference last year. Dad was a friend of the Ciceronian Society and of our themes of tradition, place, and things divine. He joined us at our 2018 conference at Hope College. He was, in particular, a partisan of place. Dad was one of the happy few who actually realized his life's ambition. Since he was in grade school, what Dad wanted to be, more than anything else, was Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives. He was in the House from 1969 to 1998, again from 2007 to 2014. And he did manage his lifelong ambition to become Speaker from 2011 to 2014. Throughout his time in office, Dad was known for his integrity. This was best exhibited when he had the distinction of chairing an investigative committee that referred both the Democrat Speaker of the House and the Republican President of the Senate to a prosecutor at the same time. But he showed it in ways great and small. That integrity was underwritten by his Christian faith, but also, I believe, by his deep love of place. My father loved Medina County, which he represented all those years in the legislature with a near-religious reverence. He loved every township, could tell a story of heroes from Medina like Colonel H.G. Blake and A.I. Root. He loved Ohio with that same reverence and revered the people in its past that made it great, particularly his lifelong hero, Senator Robert Taft. When the National Party attempted to recruit Dad to run for Congress, a seat he would have surely won, he refused, in part because it would have involved leaving Ohio. Dad understood that an abstracted love for mankind was nonsense, and that we love the places we are from because of the people in them. We serve mankind through our particular service to those particular people, male and female, black and white, that we live among in the places that we are from. Now to the award. Luke Sheen is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Duquesne University and a non-resident scholar at the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society at the University of Pennsylvania. He's author of Why Associations Matter, The Case for First Amendment Pluralism. Most importantly to many of us here, he is the editor of the University Bookman at the Russell Kirk Center. Today he will be presenting on State versus Community, Nisbet and the Post-Liberal Right. My family looked at the paper proposals to vote on this award, and both my mother, Judge Alice Batchelder, and my sister, Elizabeth Akers, were drawn immediately to the proposal from Luke Sheen because of my father's intense fondness for Robert Nisbet. One of my best memories is his driving me to Indianapolis around 2008 or thereabouts to an ISI conference on Nisbet. This was intellectually formative for me in particular, as Nisbet's ideas showed me what was wrong with abstracted universalism and how that creed is a veil worn to dress up the brute power of the modern state, forcing men to be free. Nisbet set me on my path toward fervently believing small is beautiful. My father didn't need Nisbet for that. He felt it in his bones. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Sheehan on winning this year's William G. Batchelder III Memorial Award for the Study of Place. And Ethan will begin today's panel.
Thank you, Bill. All right, so I never prepare adequately for these, so please do tell me firmly when to stop, and I will stop. Oh, and yeah, Bill mentioned that this is part of a larger project. So we published a book called Aristocratic Souls and Democratic Times a few years ago. And Ian Crow, who is here, has an essay in it on Edmund Burke. And the title of the second volume is Aristocratic Voices, Forgotten Arguments about Virtue, Authority, and Inequality. Now, there was a question from a graduate student the other day about advice on how to make your way in academia. If you're on the academic job market, don't publish a book with a title like that. But I'm not on the market anymore, so I don't care. All right, so my basic assertion in this paper on Wilhelm Riehl, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, unfortunately I don't speak German, is that it takes us back to a question that was asked at the first panel. I believe it was Sarah who asked, what are we to say about Tocqueville's prescriptions for saving democracy from itself today? Are we already in the soft despotism that he feared and that was not stopped by all the various prescriptions that he offered? And my answer to that would be yes, that we have reached that point. All of the things that Tocqueville talked about to try to restrain democracy have been more or less defeated. And so my assertion is that Tocqueville's medicine was too weak, that we need stronger medicine of some kind. And I also engage with John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill is another aristocratic liberal, and his medicine was just the wrong medicine. His medicine was expressive individualism on steroids, and we just had a panel about that, and apparently that's caused all of our ills. So, all right, so let me get back to Riehl. Nobody's ever heard of Riehl, so let me give you a little background about him. He was a German folklorist, political theorist, and novelist who achieved high repute in his time, which was the second half of the 19th century. He made a name for himself first as a political journalist in the years leading up to and in the aftermath of the Revolution of 1848. By 1851, his first book, Civil Society, had won him an invitation to the court of Bavaria's Maximilian II, where he became one of the king's advisors in cultural matters. In recognition of his contributions to scholarship and literature, and his service at the University of Munich and Munich's National Museum, he was elevated to the Bavarian nobility in 1883. Toward the end of his life, he was made a privy councillor to the king, the highest title an academic could receive. Although one scholar has called him the most significant intellectual antipode in Germany to his contemporaries Marx and Engels, the author of the English translation of his writings concludes that Riehl's views are only of historical interest today. Such a judgment is to be expected. Riehl deplored the social and cultural changes wrought by globalization, which proceeded apace in post-1848 Germany, and stood as a champion of ancient institutions already waning in his time that have since vanished altogether from the Western world. The patriarchal family, the guilds, and the Stände, the historic triad of social orders or estates, the peasants, the burghers, and the nobility. Of course, academic judgments can also be outdated. The English edition of Riehl's Natural History of the German People was published in 1990, a time when many intellectuals anticipated the global triumph of liberal democracy and the end of history. So, in the current year, the emergence of a post-liberal democratic order is treated as a real possibility, as much heralded in some quarters as it is dreaded in others. So I think Riehl possibly has something to offer to that conversation. All right, so although of plebeian birth, and although he had a great sympathy for the peasant class, Riehl is without doubt an aristocratic soul. The aristocratic themes in his work are many, and they are central to his social and political theory. In the first place, he defends Germany's landed hereditary nobility and considers the social vocation of this Stand essential to the preservation of society. He also finds much to admire in the way of life of the unreconstructed German peasant, who lives an unexamined life largely isolated from the outside world, according to the traditions of his ancestors. He advocates the development of a quasi-feudal relationship between nobles and free peasants, as serfdom was gone by this point, and a similar sense of mutual obligation between industrialists and workers, and also the restoration of the traditional relationship between the head of a household and its members. So a normal family, for real, meant not only wife and children, but also grandparents, poor relatives, apprentices, and perhaps other people under the protection of the family, all living together in the same household. So that's the traditional family from his point of view. He views cultural particularities arising from the differences of class and region as intrinsic goods, as sources of communal fellowship, fonts of vitality and beauty for the nation as a whole, and as a necessary condition for the cultivation of individual genius. He is in effect an opponent of the modern concept of sovereignty and of the bureaucratic centralization that enables it to exercise its power, a force that threatens particularity no less than the increased communication and mobility driven by capitalism. You could also call him an aristocratic nationalist, but of course his notion of nationhood is not the rationalist, individualist conception that you get from the French Revolution, but a nation is a collection of estates, of different social groups and regions who together form a nation. All right, so again, I'm trying to situate this thinker in the context of the arguments about aristocratic liberals like Tocqueville and Mill. And Mill is the one I engage with the most. Mill was concerned about a lot of the same things that Tocqueville was. And there's this one passage that I'll read from Mill that seems very current. So he's speaking of, Mill mentions in the considerations on representative government that essentially all of the diverse social classes that once existed in Europe have been reduced to two in the modern era. You have laborers and the employers of laborers. So for all these diverse states and guilds have been reduced to those two classes. And what sorts of attitudes do we get in a society that has been reduced to those two classes? Mill says this: "We know how easily the uselessness of almost every branch of knowledge may be proved to the complete satisfaction of those who do not possess it. How many not altogether stupid men think the scientific study of language useless, think ancient literature useless, all erudition useless, logic and metaphysics useless, poetry and the fine arts idle and frivolous, political economy purely mischievous. Even history has been pronounced useless and mischievous by able men. Nothing but that acquaintance with external nature, empirically acquired, which serves directly for the production of objects necessary to existence or agreeable to the senses, would get its utility recognized if people had the least encouragement to disbelieve it." So that's Mill is, for once, being useful here with that quotation. So Mill has a lot of these concerns, but of course he has absolutely the wrong answer. And his answer, as everyone knows, who has any acquaintance with Mill, is that we need some of these lifestyle liberationists and expressive individualists who will stand against public opinion and put themselves out there, and that will solve our problems. But well, we just had a panel on expressive individualism. I don't know if I can really add too much to that. I have a passage in the paper about this, but I guess my idea is that expressive individualism might be all right if you could apply some sort of limiting principle to it. And the principle that I found was this old Latin quote, "Quod licet Jovi, non licet Bovi." The correct translation, I believe, is what is permissible to Jupiter is not permissible to a cow. Or more elegantly, what gods may do, cattle may not. All right, so maybe expressive individualism, if there's a place for it, it's not for everyone. Maybe that was one of the bombs. All right. So in the 21st century, the rule of what journalist David Brooks calls the bobos, the bourgeois bohemians, has established the sort of expressive freedom and lifestyle liberation that Mill promoted, as it's now the regnant ideology, which penetrates all aspects of life, animates all social classes, and I'm quoting from, Brooks here, the ideals of this culture are constant change, maximum freedom, youthful enthusiasm, radical experimentation, repudiation of convention, and hunger for the new. This is our new elite. So it's no surprise that we have woke capitalism. These people have been like this for quite a while, and they're the ones who set the tone in our society. So if I may be permitted to engage in some cultural criticism myself, let me say that the Millian boboocracy has greatly enhanced the quality and variety of comestible and technical goods, but it is in every other respect a bovocracy, a rule by cattle. Here are my observations to support this. If there are vigorous individuals encouraging the pursuit of higher pleasures and modeling superior habits of life, as Mill hoped, such persons are neither seen nor heard. The most influential portion of the cultural elite are the celebrities and entertainers who on a daily basis dump the refuse of their feeble minds, their truth, and the dirty laundry of their daily activities on the public consciousness. There is a penchant for defiance for its own sake, which struggles to find anything worth defying. Sexagenarians, former supermodels, share pictures of their perfectly sculpted bodies as an act of rebellion against convention. Countless performative rebellions, utterly devoid of substance or effect, are carried out each day. Ill-educated and semi-psychotic media personalities spew torrents of emotive platitudes and slogans, distort and inflate unremarkable incidents into symbols of historic injustice and evil, waving so many red flags before the eyes of the masses, who then react like the poor brute beast in the matador's ring. The freaks who attract the public eye, unlike eccentrics of former ages, fail in every possible way to be even remotely interesting. In the arena of political ideas and political action, there are two dominant camps: middle-class Philistines on the one side, and on the other, crusaders against aristocracies of color, race, and sex, who are convinced that true equality can be achieved by tearing down all heroes, landmarks, symbols, and institutions of a bigoted past. Surely this is not the result that Mill was looking for, but that's what his ideas have led to. All right, we'll see if that paragraph survives peer review. All right, am I down to 3 minutes?
You're down to 2 minutes.
2 minutes, oh dear, all right. I should probably say something about real, all right, so.
You can get it for free. The audience has spoken. The panel has spoken in 1/4 grand.
All right, so let me skip ahead here. You can see Reel's political thought as a response to these kinds of bad solutions. So Reel's political thought rests on certain givens. First, there is a fundamental human tendency to form and maintain associations on the basis of a shared vocation and other common features of life. Reel notes that it is remarkable that during the revolutions of 1848, in which men marched under the banner of eliminating class hierarchies and barriers, there was at the same time a banding together and a revitalization of all manner of particular associations. Second, forces of history have produced particular types of associations that have been proven essential for national and individual well-being. And again, those are the three estates: the nobility, the bourgeoisie, and the peasant class. And finally, of course, the family is one of these essential institutions, which is the basis for all the others. All right, so the distinctiveness and vitality of these primary social groups support, more than anything else, the cultivation of extraordinary individuals of various types. To dispense with such social differentiation is thus to eliminate the most essential source of such individuality. As Reel puts it, so maybe I'll end with this quotation here. Every reform of society will only have value if it does not infringe upon the natural freshness and originality of national life, since this originality is the basis of the nation's strength. Recent times have shown convincingly in the highest estates that moral and social numbness goes hand in hand with the disappearance of originality. Peasants of a genuinely rustic temperament, burghers from head to toe, genuinely aristocratic noblemen have always been at the same time the best men. You complain that solid characters, original personalities are dying out, that there were a lot more of them in the times of our fathers. But such characters are preserved only in certain closed social groups. Whoever would erode the originality of the estates must give up the originality of individuals as well. Yet original figures of this sort, a breed already headed for extinction, have always been the true standard bearers of genuine honor and healthy traditions in the forward ranks of society. All right, so I'm almost out of time. So the essential idea is that for a healthy society, you need to have different social classes which live in different ways, have different habits. And so if you have very mobile classes that are focused on innovation and production, you also need to have conservative and stable classes like the aristocracy and the peasantry who live in a very different way, and in a sort of mixed regime can counterbalance the excesses of the more mobile classes. So I'll end there. If you want more, have your library by the book.
Thanks. No. All right, well, I'm used to being told, even by conservatives, that my ideas are just too reactionary and too, outdated, so I appreciate going second. National conservatism has presented itself over the past several years as a more genuinely conservative alternative to what's presented as a watered-down or liberalized conservatism that's typically on offer in America, and it's grounded instead in thicker social bonds. National conservatism has described its vision as the nation as, quote, the only genuine alternative to universalist ideologies now seeking to impose a homogenizing, locality-destroying imperium over the entire globe. That's from their statement of principles. As the language suggests, national conservatism then sees itself as a defender of locality and particularity over and against the forces of globalism and universalism. But it is notable that in the statement of principles and in the most thorough theoretical articulations by Yoram Hazony, place as a guiding concept is not a prominent feature of their understanding of the nation. This is in marked contrast to another notable defender of the nation against universalism and encroaching international institutions, and that is the late Roger Scruton. Roger Scruton built his understanding of the nation very clearly and explicitly on the concept of home, which he understood as a certain way of life that emerges from, as to use the phrase he often used, the place where we are. The paper is essentially a comparison of these two and teasing out some of the significant distinctions that come from this difference. So in Conservatism, a Rediscovery, Hazony defines a nation as the collection of tribes with a shared heritage, usually including common language, law, or religious tradition, and a past history of joining together against common enemies and to pursue common endeavors. Notably, the list does not feature explicitly a connection to a particular place or territory. Hazony's conceptions of tribes and nations rather centers on, quote, the bonds of mutual loyalty between people who are similar. The focus throughout is on people, their characteristics, their relationships, and their inherited obligations to one another. Certainly things that are not far away from place, but place is rarely, if ever, singled out for particular consideration. And Hazony's telling them the nation is, and these are his words, of the same kind as the family. This is the modern nation state, is of the same kind as the family, but is merely on a greater scale. It is bound together by similarities and relationships of starkly hierarchical authority, including political authority, often reliant on the beneficence and wisdom of a sort of patriarchal figure or figures. National loyalty winds up being a kind of picture, synthesis, or composite of such lower loyalties as family, clan, and tribe that are partially transformed and redirected toward the national state and the prominent people who control it. Scruton was also a defender of nations, although he often eschewed the term nationalism. Both Scruton and the National Conservatives hold that healthy political life requires some form of collective to which individuals feel like they belong. For Scruton, though, place is of central importance to the character of the nation. His entire understanding centers on people who, centers on people who live in a shared territory and the way of life that emerges from that home. The nation state, he says, results from compromises established after many conflicts and expresses the slowly forming agreement among neighbors, both to grant each other space and to protect that space as common territory. He develops that idea of the neighbor as a kind of distinct relationship, a distinctively civil relationship that's different from many of the others that mentioned. When we look for specifically national loyalties, then, he continues, we do not find them in a shared religious obedience, still less in the bonds of tribe and kinship, all three of which contribute to the core of Hazoni's understanding. The upshot of Scruton's presentation of the nation is that he emerges largely as a pre-political loyalty, not to family or tribe or to people who are like us, but to the people who live in and are committed to a particular territory. A defining characteristic of the national conservative movement over the past several years is its increasing embrace of post-liberal politics, something that Luke will speak to in much greater detail. And one thing that sets that apart from more traditional forms of American conservatism, which of course has also been very critical of liberalism as a comprehensive theory, is that post-liberal politics calls for a much more robust and substantive understanding of the common good, which government action ought to be freed to pursue directly through policy choices. And so in the national conservative understanding, the practical existence of the nation becomes almost inseparable from the politics of the national state. To be sure, Hazoni does quite unambiguously say that the two are separate, that there can be nations without states and states without nations. But the nation without a state, I would say, has a rather indistinct existence in both of his books, as a just indistinct sympathy among different tribes, but it has no clear characteristics, obligations, and notably no right to self-determination. But once the nation-state arises, the nation and the state become much less distinct. The state is the definitive and authoritative voice of the nation, and it's hard to identify any elements of nationality that are not also within the purview of the state. The national conservative commitment to the nation-state then entails a rejection, or at least a very heavy qualification, of the commitment to strictly limited and decentralized government that is generally characterized conservatism. This is often based on the assertion that there can be no, quote, neutral or civil state, but that there is always a supreme power that will impose a certain set of values and beliefs. Those characteristics that were the building blocks of the nation to begin with, things like religious belief, for instance. Hazoni says in conservatism, the strongest class or group inevitably dominates the state, and so the key to cultural regeneration is for salutary cultural norms to be, quote, embraced and encouraged by national leadership. The concept of neighborliness that grows out of Scruton's prioritization of place and territory over kinship, religion, and tribal loyalties makes possible Scruton's conception, in contradiction with Hazoni, of a distinctively civil society governed by law that emerges from below, rather than law that amounts to commands that come from above and reflect a particular set of shared characteristics, that dominant class that imposes its views on the state. The sort of cultural unity that Scruton points to as establishing the first person plural, again, a phrase he uses quite often, this sort of cultural unity, he says, does not lay claim to the soul of the members of the community, because to do so would be to destroy their ability to live in a civil state, interacting freely and establishing the norms of interaction as the residue of human agreements. In this, he adopts Michael Oakeshott's model of civil association, which emphasizes purposeless association, not aimed or ordered to a particular substantive end or common endeavor, but merely for its own sake. Scruton contrasts this civil society explicitly with the family. He says the order of the city is not that of the family. It does not suppose that people can easily agree or that there is any one goal toward which they aspire. It sees people as irretrievably diverse, but possessed, nevertheless, of the capacity to live in peace and to adapt through consent and consensus. So the nation, in Scruton's understanding, is not of the same kind as the family, clan, or tribe. Scruton therefore identifies many elements of nationality that are not, properly speaking, the purview of politics and the state. Indeed, the kind of cultural unity he has in mind is one that he says politics itself cannot provide. The state's primary purpose is the establishment of those side constraints that make peaceful, ordered life together in a certain place possible. In this model, then, the nation-state is not particularly optimized to pursue the strength and cohesion of the collective, or optimized for the pursuit of a distinctive and substantive common good, as the national conservative vision often holds. This task, this vision of the purpose of the national state, for Scruton would slide easily into the purposive or enterprise association that Scruton, following Oakeshott, distrusts. And Scruton's vision of civil government, then, is also in marked contrast to the strict hierarchical lines of political authority valued by Hazoni. The distinction between these two depictions of the nation has important implications for the American context related to the country's size and to American conservatives' traditional commitment to federalism. Since federalism has been a pillar of American conservatism, it is not simply jettisoned by national conservatism, but their vision of it is quite different than what came before. The Statement of Principles, for instance, the National Conservative Statement of Principles, endorses federalism in the following language. We recommend the Federalist Principle, which prescribes a delegation of power to the respective states or subdivisions of the nation. I have to immediately note the inversion of the American constitutional structure, in which the delegation explicitly goes the other way, from the states to the central government, as confirmed in the 10th Amendment. Moreover, both in the Statement of Principles and in Hazoni's Virtue of Nationalism, both of those are clear in granting the central authority a definitive and unlimited oversight over the conduct of localities. The government that sits atop the federal structure, Hazoni says, remains responsible for determining the appropriate degree of delegated authority at all times. On this point, then, it has been well observed by others that national conservatives have conceded the 20th century progressive constitutional revolution, and in that sense, they are defenders of the status quo. Once the nation-state has been formed, it is the authority, or it is that authority that directs national life and maintains, by force if necessary, the loyalty of the parts. And so some national conservatives can embrace even the rise of an imperial judiciary and a morphing constitution insofar as it is used to promote national cohesion and the common good. Scruton never devoted too much attention to the American political tradition, close attention to the American political tradition. His discussion of place and home largely take place in a very English context. Occasionally, Scruton references American nationality as emerging from patterns of settlement and life under common law, but he doesn't examine those dynamics very closely. One thing, however, should be clear. By grounding the nation in a way of life emerging from a particular place, it becomes impossible to disconnect the desire for freedom and self-government that's characteristic of the nation from the localities where we actually live. And in England, Scruton valued the way, in his words, locality was deeply entrenched into the whole system of government with real authority that was not delegated from above, but that is grown up from below, retaining an ability to defend local prerogatives against centralizing tendencies. If hierarchical lines of authority extend to faraway places where most citizens have never been, much less lived, and to people whose life is not only different but foreign, those lines of authority must be severely attenuated and modulated by locality for any sense of national attachment along the lines that Scruton proposes to be realistic. As Scruton suggests, genuine culture is not something that can be imposed from the top down. Government might encourage or demand adherence to certain markers of culture that once existed, but they will constitute merely a simulacrum of the culture that emerges from actual physical proximate life together. A different conservative alternative to globalist universalism, then, seems to exist in a robust commitment to locality and federalism. And this can be conceptualized by understanding the American constitutional order as defined even more completely than the average nation-state by the civil association model. Scruton argues that the responsibility of the state is mostly the enforcement of side constraints, right, the substance of which emerged from social consensus. But in the American context, the constitutional system as originally conceived met that description in a fuller way than any other modern state, emerging as a consensus only on certain powers for the central government that touched only remotely and secondarily the daily lives of citizens, leaving states and localities free to develop their own civil life and their own cultural markers of it. National conservatives, however, often seem to take their conceptual and aesthetic bearings from European politics, where actual life in a particular place, markers of cultural identity, and state borders are more likely to come packaged together. So from today's ongoing tension between national identity and the bureaucratized politics of the EU, I think they draw out simply an attachment to the nation state, its cultural markers, and its political authority as the guiding conservative principles. But that lesson does not apply as easily to the American context. History, culture, and geography make the importation of European conservatism to America more tenuous. Abroad, for instance, national conservatives praise countries like Hungary, which is roughly the size of Indiana, with the population of Michigan, and Poland, which is roughly the size of New Mexico, with the population of, grantedly, the large California, but still. Attempts to fashion an American nation along the lines of those examples will not only fail, but inhibit the possibility of the sort of civil order that makes genuine cultural growth possible. To conclude, no one, I think, could call with a straight face Roger Scruton an Enlightenment liberal. Yet the vision of the sort of limited state, distinct from civil society, that does not attempt to shape the soul of its citizens and aims at consensus over purity is precisely what national conservatives and other post-liberal thinkers often attack as an Enlightenment liberal view. So at the very least, I think putting the national conservative vision in conversation with Scruton should bring into question the claim that their understanding of the nation is the only alternative to globalism and universalism. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the Batchelder family. It's quite an honor to receive recognition, of course, but especially when the recognition is the namesake of a man of Mr. Batchelder's character and reputation. So thank you very much. And please do pass that on. Many have decried the decline of community and the ensuing social pathologies of alienation and anomie. A recent movement of self-described post-liberals, including Adrian Vermeulen, Patrick Deneen, Chat Pecknold, and Gladden Papin, have named individual autonomy core to many conceptions of liberalism, including in the American constitutional system, as the primary culprit. To remedy contemporary purported deficits in liberal politics and economics, post-liberals advocate a non-liberal understanding of political order. In Common Good Constitutionalism, Vermeulen argues for a return to the classical legal order focusing on the common good. His scheme consists of a call for centralization of political power and social authority in the federal government, especially in the presidency. Deneen argues that the American constitutional system is liberal to the core, privileging individual autonomy above other values and driving alienation and other social pathologies in the 20th century. Rather than seeing 20th century progressivism as an aberration from the classical liberalism of the American founding, Deneen argues that it is the inevitable outcome of liberal presuppositions regarding political order and the individual embedded in American constitutional order. Pecknold would have the government restore blue laws to bolster religious organizations, and Papin goes so far as to call conservatives the party of the state. While rejecting mainstays of the American constitutional order, such as limited government and federalism, those in the post-liberal fold embrace the state-based conservatism of Hungary's Viktor Orban, who has used state power in various ways to advance pro-family social policies with the goal of cultivating an ostensibly conservative social order. This paper does not challenge the values the post-liberals claim to advance, family, religion, and the like, but the political method they choose to advance them. The question it answers is, does the structure of monist state power advocated by the post-liberal right lend itself to the cultivation of a conservative social order constituted by vibrant family life, dynamic religious organizations, active local communities, and enterprising voluntary associations? To answer this question, I turn to the American sociologist Robert Nisbet, of no surprise to some of you who know my work. famous for his defense of traditional communities against atomizing influences of the modern state in his 1953 classic, The Quest for Community. Nisbet's political theory posits two fundamentally opposed ways of viewing politics, not liberalism and conservatism, but monism and pluralism, drawn from William James's famous dichotomy. This way of thinking shaped Nisbet's approach to understanding political theory and action through history. In Nisbet's political thought, monism perceives unity in the state as the highest goal of political order, and individual citizenship in the state is membership in the highest form of community. Groups that make claims upon the individual citizen must be subdued, their authority and influence reduced, or they must be fundamentally reoriented toward shaping their individual members to be better citizens of the state. The pluralist perspective in political thought sees not unity, but irreducible plurality of groups making up the political order. Membership in a variety of groups is essential to a healthy political order. Where unity is the ideal for the monist, pluralists believe moral and political good to lay precisely in the plurality of social authorities, providing individuals with a variety of sources of identity and meaning. Nisbet's fundamental concern with the post-liberal project would have been its fundamental monism, its embrace of centralized political power, no matter the values it purportedly advances. Nisbet identified early in his career that the monist state could be wildly inhumane, as it was in the totalitarian states of the 20th century. But the monist account of politics was inhumane even in its democratic form, because the monist form of political order resulted in the alienated individual, a person unhitched from meaningful social bonds and tending towards self-destruction. The widespread sense of alienation in Western democracies and its relation to political power was the impetus for Nisbet's first and most famous book, The Quest for Community. Nisbet writes there, "The single most impressive fact in the 20th century in Western society is the fateful combination of a widespread quest for community in whatever form, moral, social, political, and the apparatus of political power that has become so vast in contemporary democratic states. The growth of political power and the widespread quest for community, spurred by alienation, are not separate phenomena, but a single fact. The intrusion of political power caused individualization, which inevitably resulted in alienation. Individuals, liberated from their traditional sources of authority, are not autonomous, self-sufficing, and stable, emancipated from tradition and authority. Rather, they are insecure, adrift, alienated from the world around them," Nisbet explains. When the individual is thrown back upon his own inner resources, when he loses the sense of moral and social involvement with others, he becomes prey to sensations of anxiety and guilt. Self-destruction is frequently the only way out. Nisbet writes, "The highest rates of suicide and insanity are to be found in those areas of society in which moral and social individualism is the greatest." With the loss of traditional communities through politicization is the loss of a sense of belonging, of a close identification with other human beings. Individuals in this alienated state seek a community, a source of authority and camaraderie. He writes, "The ominous preoccupation with community, revealed by modern thought and mass behavior, is a manifestation of certain profound dislocations in the primary associative areas of society. Dislocations which have been created to a great extent by the structure of the Western political state. As it is treated here," speaking of his book, "the problem is social. Social in that it pertains to the statuses and social memberships which men hold or seek to hold, and the problem is also political. Political in that it is a reflection of the present location and distribution of power in society. Having disrupted traditional authority and absorbed traditional functions of family, town, guild, and religion, and individualized the populace through the assertion of political power, the state appears to be the only community that can provide the sense of belonging. However, the power of the state is a poor substitute for the sense of belonging of close face-to-face interactions under plurality of social authorities. The more power the state accrues, the more it intrudes into bonds of social authority, and the more individuals are disconnected from their social ties." Nisbet argues that the reason political power has this effect is that political power is derived from a stratified military order, specifically designed to annihilate non-military relationships. The military chieftain, an individual warrior, is the historical beginning and also fundamental model for the political community. This was true in Augustan Rome, in Cleistinian Athens, in the ancient world, and in the French and Chinese revolutions in the modern world. In times of war, the authority of the chieftain must be absolute, and the authority must be absolutely obedient, setting the stage for the idea of sovereignty. The individual can have no other loyalties but to the chieftain, at least as long as the war band remains relevant. Likewise, the citizen must be loyal to the state above any other loyalties to religion, family, local community, profession, and the like. Both war and politics manifest the fundamental dichotomy of central power and individual shorn of social attachments in its conception of communal order. Furthermore, both war and politics claim to be the highest form of community, war for reasons of necessity and politics for reasons of justice and community. Both are inherently opposed to traditional social groups' claims of authority and membership over individuals, and each suppresses social groups in the name of their community, especially the kinship group. For Nisbet, the very structure of political order as it is generally understood by the great philosophers from Plato to Rousseau to Rawls is inherently opposed to social groups. Where post-liberals accuse both classical and modern liberals of utilizing state power to undermine social institutions, post-liberals would use state power to bolster social institutions. Nisbet's concern with the post-liberal project would be that it shares in the fundamental political monism of the modern ideologies it criticizes, even while claiming to engage in a Nisbetian project of social resuscitation. Two examples from the post-liberal program illustrate its fundamental monism: Vermeule's common good constitutionalism, which I spoke about at length last year, and the post-liberal family policy program. Vermeule argues in Common Good Constitutionalism for the unity of the common good and for its enforcement through the centralized political power. He writes, "The common good is unitary and indivisible, not an aggregation of individual utilities. In its temporal aspect, it represents the highest felicity or happiness of the whole political community, which is also the highest good of the individuals comprising that community. This unity is what makes the common good common." The common good is such that it must be sought by the highest form of community. For Vermeule, that is the federal government in the American system, and more specifically, the office of the president. He disparages the American system of federalism as an attempt to divide sovereignty in a way inappropriate to a proper understanding of a just and humane legal order. While traditional federalism denies the federal government a police power, Vermeule praises jurisprudential developments since 1937, when the Supreme Court utilized the General Welfare Clause in the 14th Amendment to recognize what amounts to a police power for the federal government. Furthermore, Vermeule rejects the supremacy of Congress in our constitutional system. The structure of Congress as a geographically representative body lends itself to division and strife. The executive power is much more accommodating to the nature of the common good, as the American president represents the whole country in a substantive way. He describes the federal bureaucracy as the strong hand of legitimate rule. The president, through the administrative state, may operate as a unified political force to instantiate the common good. The post-liberal order defends aggressive state support for social groups, particularly the family. This is seen in the post-liberal support for Viktor Orban, four-term president of Hungary. The Hungarian government under Orban now spends 6.3% of GDP on pro-family policies. Businesses are regulated to be more family-friendly. The post-liberals argue that the federal government should follow suit. The post-liberals do not shy away from a broader policy of state support for private institutions beyond the family, especially religious institutions. For example, reinstituting blue laws to protect religious organizations from having to compete with corporations for their members' time. Corporations that at best care little for religion and at worst are openly hostile. Similarly, post-liberals are supportive of Orban's work to direct the Hungarian state to rebuild and support churches. The post-liberals do understand a role for civil society apart from government, but their program generally focuses upon government as the organizing force behind civil society. This is perhaps best demonstrated in Vermeule's account of subsidiarity. Vermeule writes, "Constitutional law should elaborate subsidiary principles that help public authorities direct persons, associations, and society generally toward the common good. Rather than undermining the principles of subsidiarity as providing autonomy, rather than understanding the principles of subsidiarity as providing autonomy for smaller social groups, Vermeule sees it as license for the centralized political state to direct the smaller social unities toward its larger goals. Removing disincentives for family is one thing, it is quite another to devise a political program that subsumes all associations, including the family, into a unifying monist political vision." The question Nisbet's work poses to the post-liberal right is, can the political state, that through the very structure of power, divested social institutions of their moral and functional value in the lives of individuals, be the means whereby those institutions are revived? I think. Nisbet would find that doubtful. Writing in 1975, over 20 years after the publication of Quest, Nisbet noted that monist political thinking dominated the major ideologies. He writes, "Politics in our era has become nearly devoid of genuinely ideological divisions as is possible to conceive. We are in a condition astonishingly like that which beset Rome during the last century or so of the Republic, when all traditional intellectual and political issues disappeared, and with them parties in the true sense, to be replaced by mere power blocks, each with nothing more than lust for office to guide it," end quote. Where once liberalism, radicalism, and conservatism had offered substantive competing visions of political and social good, each merely sought political power for its own sake. Liberalism had abandoned its emphasis upon individual immunity from state power for the sake of individual liberation through the exercise of state power. Radicalism, through the influence of the New Left, had become mere flight into the subjective. And worst of all, the conservatism of Burke and his disciples on both sides of the Atlantic had emphasized the preservation of immunities for traditional institutions associated with religion, family, and local community. But by the latter half of the 20th century, it was little more than, in Nisbet's terms, mere rightism, power seeking for its own sake. The post-liberal project has much to offer in reviving ways of political thinking that transcend some of the modern myopia afflicting our political discourse, but it fails to question the core assumptions of the operation of political power and its inevitably deleterious effect upon the social order. The post-liberal attempt to redirect state power from individualizing the populace to reintegrating it into meaningful communities is dubious from Nisbet's perspective because the origins and structure of state power as such that it is inherently a social solvent. Thank you.
Hello, there we go. I'm going to time myself, but I'm actually not going to watch the timer. Presidential privilege. So some of you may know that I have opinions on post-liberalism that I have published, sometimes in an outstanding publication called Law and Liberty. But I want to start off, instead of talking about that, I want to talk about the pure, uncut, quality Ciceronian, the vintage Ciceronian presentation of Ethan. Those of you who were there in the before times, those when the days of creation, you will know that that is how you do it. My thoughts on Ethan's paper are a little less organized, in part because I am so unfamiliar with this figure, but I love this kind of work where people recover forgotten figures of great importance who've been left behind because of revising a canon towards a particular political school, and Real doesn't really fall into that. I'm not going to say his name right either, by the way, and I ostensibly know German. Passed the language exam in graduate school in let's not dwell on what year. I really want to start off by talking about this reinterpretation of Mill as an aristocratic liberal was very refreshing, given that Mill is usually in a list of people we just call liberal. And there's not much time spent with his work because we all think we already know what it says. But the problem with Mill, of course, is that he cannot, as we had it colorfully put, he cannot, by dint of his design of his theory, prevent Philistinism. And so the Philistines won. But not merely because of the success of their ideas, seems to be the emphasis in Real, but because of their occupations becoming more lucrative than traditional aristocratic ventures. Not to be a Marxist, but this is a material cause, not just an ideal or intellectual cause And so I wonder sometimes if Riel's sort of missing something here because he's a bit in the clouds. Another question I had when I was reading this is exactly how aristocratic were the aristocrats of Riel's time? Wouldn't they have already been debased by the democratic age? At Ave Maria University, you've probably already heard me do this joke, I'm the most left-wing member of faculty because I believe in constitutional republicanism. There was, for a while, 2 members of the Austrian aristocracy in our theology department who were avid supporters of restoring the Habsburg Empire. Not enthusiastic about restoring the Habsburg Empire are the Habsburgs. The heir, I believe, being a person who's very enthusiastic about F1 cars. So, and I think this may have already begun by the time Riel's writing. Another thing that makes me very nervous is this idea of the nation as organic. This is just like what the progressives were drinking deeply from when they were there. And so you wonder, like, did Riel have a conception that simply did not make sense to the Americans visiting Germany to study in their schools? By far, my favorite part, not to say the best part, really the whole paper is great. I mean, obviously the best part is the part where he's talking about sextenarians taking pictures of the world. I mean, let's be great, that's honest. I was reading his paper first, I was like, oh, this is it, man. But there's a discussion that he did not bring up, and this was the discussion of forestry. And I know everyone's very excited, right? But the discussion of forestry was great because it really has this like a profoundly Ciceronian quality to it, and that forestry is something that you can't rush because trees don't grow really fast. There is this one sponsor on podcast, some of you may know about fast-growing trees. It's a lie. I have some of their trees. They grow about the same. But that does, what's that? Yeah, so this is what's funny is that like even the trees, we're coming for them, right? We are going to bourgeois tree growth, but unfortunately, it's not happening. And the reason it's, and so there are skills that one needs to have that are slow. And so where there are forests as Riel, and as you do a great job of teasing out Riel, you have aristocratic ways, not necessarily always aristocracy, but at least aristocratic ways. Aristocracy also were interested in preserving them because these often became places for hunting, one of the great aristocratic traditions. Just to close this out, it made me also, the paper also made me think of what Sam Gregg refers to as Davos Man. Davos Man is the new aristocracy discussed at the end of the paper and also sort of at the beginning. One of the things about Davos Man we tend to overlook is that Davos is actually a place. And it has its own sense of place, which is mostly armed security and private jets. And Silicon Valley is a place. And there's been a lot of realization from people who've developed apps in Silicon Valley is that despite their best efforts, they've often, unfortunately, developed apps that are more in service to people who live in San Francisco. They work best there. Living as I do in Ave Maria's tomato fields, I get these push updates from Uber Eats. They're like, hey, would you like 50% off $20 or more? I was like, yes, so let me go, oh no, there's no one delivering, right? No one in Ave Maria is delivering, there's no one, like, and miles away. And so this is the problem that happens with aristocracy that believe they are placeless or that they are doing something universal, but actually have inherited without knowledge of this, the fact of place. So we have this hybrid aristo-bourgeois class whose legitimacy depends on repudiating their own local cultures from which they heralded, many of them come from all over the country, all over the world, for one of the courts of Modesto County. So now to John Grove. I'll be a little bit more disciplined now. Sorry. I had to be a little old school with Ethan. This is new to me as a Ciceronian society. It's very good, but it also makes me a little nervous. So once Grove observes that national conservatives lack a sense of place, I began to see its absence everywhere in their work. It was a real eye-opener for me. And this issue is one that I think simply does not get enough attention. So I'm very grateful for this paper. Much of this, I suspect, has to do with how Hazony treats his intellectual project. Oddly, Hazony seems indifferent to telling the truth as much as telling a story. How we started off this, right, with Jason Blakely, right? He hopes the story will be persuasive, but also convenient for shepherding his motley crew of West Coast Straussians, reactionaries, gay vitalists, and Orrin Cass. That was funny. Laugh. Hazony is a conservative Zionist Jew. He understands that most people are not. So he can't appeal to a Jewish holy place as a common starting point. And moreover, there's really only one in Judaism, and that's the Temple Mount, which, to put mildly, is a fraught issue for him. So given these circumstances, it makes sense that he would rather avoid a place as a subject, since it would likely inspire, anywhere from ambivalence to some division within the coalition he's building. So, joined to Hazony's love for the nation of Israel is his admiration for the British Empire, which, very strangely, he insists calling a nation. It's a huge nation, right? Because he thinks empires are bad. And England is good. It can't be an empire. Empires are Catholic. If you haven't read the book, this is the typology he devises. And England most certainly is not Catholic, despite our best efforts. When discussing his work at a recent Liberty Fund, I posited that Hazony's parents, at least intellectually, were Theodore Herzl and Queen Victoria. Hazony has the typical post-liberal problem of not knowing or caring about history except as implicitly a Hegelian dialectic, that is, as a narrative of ideas in conflict. All action is the result of political ideas of which we are avatars. Such a view of politics is, as Grove concludes quite well, simply not have a sense of place. At best, we could say that he does have one in the city, which is a regime type he describes, but he doesn't talk about the city because the city is, as a regime, over. Instead, he seems to be he seems to want to build an intellectual achievement of the nation. Its perfect expression is in the modern state of Israel, and he spends much of his time now engaging the daily labor of dismissing, denying, and minimizing the inadequacy of his approach. I want to highlight a particular paragraph that I think is, at least for me, a dagger in the heart for Hazony that Grove writes. National conservatives often seem to take their conceptual and aesthetic bearings from European politics, where actual life in a particular place, markers of cultural identity, and state borders are more likely to parallel one another. So from today's ongoing tension between national identity and the bureaucratized politics of the EU, they draw out simply an attachment to the nation state and its authority. But that lesson does not apply as easily to the American context. History, culture, and geography make the importation of European conservatism to America highly tenuous. And this is why he had to write the book he wrote second on the attempt to retrieve conservatism. And when you read it, the figures that you would expect to see there as part of the American political tradition that many of us study are absent. Is essentially invent a new version of conservatism to reconcile his extremely curious ideas. So Scruton was so different because he speaks not merely of ideas but of memories, of stories, of family members, of places, and these are not the same as the abstract ideas spun by Hazony's intellectual narrative. He can do this because Scruton was primarily interested in asking and answering philosophical questions, and philosophical questions are not purely abstract because they are asked by particular persons and depend on different experiences. Hence, Scruton does not present any ideological or political program as the answer, but simply the result of his contemplation for us to contemplate with him. Such contemplation produces not a useful past for dissident movements on the right, rather the good life that forms the basis of civilized living. One might conclude from all this his admiration of the British Empire, Husoni does not understand it, feeding as he does from what Slavoj Žižek calls the garbage dumpster of ideology. Grove shows that Scruton did because, for him, it was first a place and then a nation, and all the good things in making a nation depend on the English for the daily lives with all their virtues and vices. Finally, our Batchelder Award winner, Luke Sheehan. Am I going to be good? I'm not going to be good. So, Sheehan proves that post-liberals are poor students of Nisbet, and interested not so much in his vision, but in prying pieces off his critique for their own use. The only conclusion one can reach from his analysis is that these pieces are in service to a state they imagine they can impose as a monistic order, one which Adrian Vermeule has called the Empire Guadalupe. They use this vision as part of their post-liberal order that they recommend, and their avatars like Viktor Orban and Xi Jinping are doing what Sheehan describes by way of Nisbet as those of Cleisthenes, Augustus, and the French Revolution. Secure the state under a single rule and impose order from above. So this would be, as opposed to the Davos man, this would be the Budapest man, or the Beijing man. It should not surprise anyone with the source material from which these post-liberals draw. The origin of their thought is in the 19th century Catholic reaction to the French Revolution among the refractories, or the priests opposed to the civil constitution of the clergy, who looked beyond the mountains or became ultramontanists to Rome. The foundational theorists of this movement, such as Joseph de Maistre, did not defend the Catholic scholastic tradition as they saw it antiquated. Maistre, for example, makes no use of natural law or the common good as it was traditionally treated in his work, but only demonstrates the effective use of power for their preferred regime. In other words, the post-liberals are just as modern as the liberalism they purport to reject. As a friend of mine joked, the common good is not an eternal, indivisible, infinite salvation found God's grace, the pursuit of which is guaranteed by government protection. No, the common good is what post-liberals will do to us. Hence, for all the talk of Nisbet, the thought of Patrick Deneen is yoked, as it is with Adrian Vermeule, to the absolute monarchists like Maistre and Juan Donoso Cortez, as well as the crown jurist of the Third Reich, Carl Schmitt. At the recent Restoring the Nation conference at Franciscan University of Steubenville, some post-liberals dismissed the small platoons of local life as an outmoded, ill-equipped response to raw state power imposed on the faithful. They recommended fighting fire with fire, wherein the post-liberal state uses raw state power to impose the faithful on the unfaithful. The use of force can be bureaucratic regulation or an executive-imposed rule, and these seem antithetical to Deneen's original project from why liberalism failed, of repudiating the ideology of the state in favor of regime change from the ground up. Nisbet, as Sheehan shows, is useful only for critique, and one wonders whether Nisbet is providing intellectual cover for less savory figures. For this reason, I would revise the terms that Sheehan uses when discussing the way post-liberals describe who the people are under the post-liberal regime. He continued to use the term citizen. That is not the term Adrian Vermeule used in his essay in The Atlantic on common good constitutionalism. Halfway through the essay, he very intentionally shifts from the use of the word citizen to the word subject, in which the subjugation of the person is to the state, not out of some regrettable necessity or emergency of the moment, but nothing less as the objective for the post-liberal enterprise in which they're all engaged. So now I will pose a question, having engaged, that was modest, 16 minutes of pure indulgence for me. I get that much, right?
You're fired.
But the questions that I have, they're sort of the same question put in two ways. The three papers raise and criticize ideologies as a kind of monism and appeal to some greater particularism. Where do you see any productive disagreements among real Nisbet and Scruton? Another way of asking this question is, Reel seems to want to reconcile place with nation in a way that Nisbet resists, but Scruton at least considers. Who gets this right, or where do you think there might be opportunities for productive discussion?
Do you want to go to the panelists first, or I have a mic if you want to go to the audience?
If you don't want to answer that question and think it's bad, okay.
I'm just going to prompt Luke, really. So, but if I recall correctly, I think Nisbet and Scruton, I think Nisbet would have been much more skeptical of any form of national narrative, any like distinctive national narrative that attempted to sort of put all of these characteristics and practices into one nice package that is the nation. Whereas Scruton was doing that. Scruton was very, he was open with the fact that all nations are creations of some form. And he thought there were some that were just conscious creations of powerful people who sought to impose this sort of narrative for their own purposes. And then there were also better ones that did genuinely kind of emerge out of consensus and practice. Whereas my sense of Nisbet is that he would be more skeptical of any of these attempts to kind of make the nation as all the component elements that Scruton points to. I think Nisbet would probably like, but putting them together in that way, maybe he would have been less. But you could tell me I'm completely wrong.
No, I think that's probably correct. Nisbet was very suspicious of the nation or nationalism kind of in any form of the 19th century gave to us. So he kind of rejected those narratives as kind of fundamentally suspect. It was a great story that kings could tell to consolidate their power, but it wasn't necessarily something that those stories would always be told at the expense of local communities, at the expense of kinship groups, at the expense of kind of anything Nisbetian.
Yeah, I think for someone like Reel, his nationalism, if he has one, it's one based on an early modern conception of the nation. So it's, again, the nation is not some package or synthesis of different elements, but it is the sum of all those different elements which remain distinct. And this notion of nationhood is not compatible with a centralized state. It's one that requires self-government of the regions.
We'll open it up to questions now, although I want to take issue with James Patterson's remark that he said that hunting was aristocratic. If anyone wants to go with me in their camouflage to Tally's Bar in northern Michigan, you'll see it is far from that.
Thanks. My question is for John. You mentioned that the post-liberals are interested in using state power to support the social groups, whereas previously there was an attempt to squash them. And I'm wondering how you would connect that idea of what they're trying to do to the way the Catholic principle of subsidiarity often gets articulated, which is we want the most local group to handle things, but if they have trouble, then a higher group should support it. Are they actually acting consistently with the way that principle is articulated, or am I getting that wrong?
The way you articulated there, I'd say that's pretty much how the National Conservative Statement and Hazoni's book says that it's fine for localities and in the American context states to handle most things, and indeed it's preferable, but the higher authority is always the supervising authority. So I'm not going to say anything about Catholic social thought broadly speaking, but the way you presented it right there, subsidiarity, that would be generally the way that they present it, as opposed to the idea that localities or states have a definitive authority that is their own and that is not being supervised, or at least in theory not supervised by a higher authority that can then come and sort of and correct it. Yeah.
Thanks very much all for your papers. My question is also for John. Kind of want to ask you to think about how Scruton's approach to sort of a national identity, or might apply in our context of fairly deep cultural divisions. So this idea of, hey, out of neighborliness emerges the broader national civil order. And I'm sort of, what I'm kind of asking about, thinking about, how the way forward for conservatism, how should we think about things like states trying to reassert control of public education, or outlawing things like ostensibly gender-affirming care, state level rulings or laws that are consistent with federalism, but are at the same time impositions of state power and might not be consistent with this idea of, building a neighborly culture together and then letting the civil order fall out of that. Just was curious if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, so you want me to just solve all the problems of conservatism? Thanks. I don't really, it's hard to approach that because that's such a huge question. But I think one of the key elements, and really, like I noted, Scruton is really borrowing from Oakeshott on this, and one of the things that's very useful for understanding these things is that Oakeshott really refocuses attention on the question of like the task and what the state is really tasked with doing, as opposed to thinking about like what are its hard limits or origins or things like that, and sometimes get distracted in like the liberalism debates. What is it that it's supposed to be doing? And for Oakeshott and then Scruton kind of borrowing that and that idea of civil association, right? The task is to manage an ordered and peaceful civic life. So there are all sorts of issues that doesn't tell you how to solve an issue. So for things like public schools, public schools require certain like rules and orders and so forth, and there's nothing in the idea of civil association that says you have to, if you're going to have public schools, which I don't think we should, but if you're going to have public schools, right, you have to have rules and orders that make them reasonable, that students from the community can go there and do what the school is supposed to do. So there are plenty of things that I think sometimes more moderate conservative, all those words are dumb, but moderate conservatives kind of come down on like Ron DeSantis or somebody as saying we're using state power. But in some of those, that's if you're going to have a public school, you have to have rules, and that's reasonable. As opposed to, say, policies where the task and the aim of that policy really is to, okay, how do we use the state to change the culture? That, I think, would be more problematic in the civil association, that if you have a distinctive plan to use the state in such a way that's trying to manufacture a particular kind of unity that doesn't exist, right, that's a little more problematic. So, for instance, like rules in school that prevent sex books from being in the library, that's just things like, if you really get down to most parents, they'll be like, yeah, that's probably not something that should be there, right? But as opposed to going through the library systematically and removing any book that doesn't fit right in the perfect kind of social order you're trying to create, that would be much more problematic. So I don't know. I would just say that would be. I think the usefulness of it is kind of refocusing on the idea of establishing civil social order, as opposed to just political debates being a titanic clash over ultimate ends, which I think is where the dialogue often goes today, is that it's all about ends and the highest good and those sorts of things. And I think Scruton and Oakeshott both bring it down from that and aim it more narrowly.
Is it on now? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. And I just actually wanted to ask more specifically again about the subsidiarity thing, because I'm coming from a background of Catholic social teaching and thinking about subsidiarity as the lower level should do what it can to solve problems, and then the higher level should be there to help it, and the common good, it's not just that there's one common good, but that there are many common goods. A friendship is a common good, a marriage is a common good, a city can be a common good, and so on. And then a higher common good would be a nation. There could be common good among different nations. There can be international law. And so I just wonder how much how much in each of your, it sounds like Nisbet is just really against, I don't know, there being nations almost, and what that means. It sounds like Real just has a kind of vague sense of what a nation is and thinks that the only political units are these smaller states. And I'm not sure what Scruton's alternative is either. So I just would like you to, if you can, maybe respond to that description of subsidiarity and the common good and say how Scruton or Nisbet or Real are different from that, or whether they're actually just different expressions of subsidiarity and the common good.
Good. So Nisbet's critique, it does, at least one reading of him, is he seems to have no place whatsoever for political power. No state can ever exist. He's not a Pollyannish thinker, so it's not what he's aimed at. What he is trying to articulate is that political power, as we tend to understand it, he calls it ideas. The state became an idea system. So what he means is the way we think about state power is in this way of it being a sovereign entity over which it rules the rest of us absolutely. And its historical origin being, Cleisthenes, the general, the Emperor Augustine, the general, and so on, always coming out of this military order, and it's how we think about it. But what he's not talking about are actual institutions. So he gets in this in Quest and elsewhere. So there is such a thing as actual institutions. What he's trying to extirpate is the idea system that we impose upon the necessary political institutions that we have. So we see in a practical way the necessity of legislative government and executive power and these necessary elements of an effective political order, balancing against pre-existing entities that we call states in our system, and thinking kind of practically about how they relate to each other, and instead we impose sovereignty. So where does sovereignty rise? Where does sovereignty rest? That's Vermeule's very specific. Sovereignty is in one place always, and it's right here in the federal government, and specifically the presidency, and he's going to impose that on our system. And that's precisely what Nisbet's after, is stop doing that. In fact, just stop talking about sovereignty altogether. That would be his view. So let's talk instead about kind of proper places of authority that make sense in a much more practical way. So he's a very kind of practical thinker when he's pushing back against a particular understanding of political power that he sees in, especially as political power gets bound up with core conceptions of justice and political right from Plato to Rousseau. There's one place you can find justice, and it's in the central state. And it's the one that's only source of justice for these thinkers. And I realize he's way oversimplifying Plato, not so much Rousseau, but way oversimplifying Plato, but it is the vision of political power that we get, and that's what he's going after. So he was a big fan. He doesn't really talk about subsidiarity specifically, but it is what he's thinking about. He's thinking about it as an agnostic sociologist and influenced by Durkheim and not as a Catholic social thinker. But what he says is really close to what Kuyper says about sphere sovereignty and the Catholic social thought. So thinking about, in practical matters, who's really best suited to raise and socialize children? Probably the family, and go out on a limb. Who's best going to make the decisions about education? Probably the family in conjunction with other families in a local community, probably with well-educated people in the area, probably the clergy. These are very practical ways, and they seem to be the best locations of it. If you're coming at it from the idea system of the state, it's got to be imposed and redirected. And this is in Dewey towards the democratic man. It's in, I think, in the German system of what's his name, and in Vermeule, and that's okay. We'll just reorient our education programs. But Vermeule's discussion of subsidiarity is almost criminally backwards. It's the complete reverse of what you just said. It's all about the central state utilizing local associations towards its own ends. And exactly what you said about the common good being in the plural. It is not, as I recall, anywhere in Vermeule in the plural. It's always in the singular and capitalized. And it seems like Nisbet would say, there are common good, but it's common goods. How do we sort through them? How do you really know what's common good for the Sheeans, all four of us, and then what's common good for the Ciceronian Society and for Pennsylvanians and for North Carolinians and then for Americans? That's one question. But it's what you said about subsidiarity. Nisbet would have been 100% behind.
Yeah, I think Scruton he would also subscribe to that idea. When I was talking earlier to Jason's point was, I think both Scruton, but even more Nisbet, I think they were very attuned to the incentives at work in the modern nation state, especially like the modern democratic nation state, to, if their role in the kind of structure of subsidiarity is this sort of overseer that has a generalized authority to kind of step in, and the more localized authorities don't really have any meaningful way to resist that. If it's wrong, then there are a lot of incentives at work for that national authority not to be there to help, to facilitate, or to step in when there's a genuinely national problem, but instead to usurp the role of family, of congregation, of community, of local government, and that sort of thing. So that's what I was talking about there was it kind of depends on what is the rule in the structure of subsidiarity. What is the rule that allows then that higher authority to say, okay, well, something else needs to be done. Exactly how that's articulated is very important, because there's a lot of incentives to just take all of those responsibilities and bring them up the hierarchy.
Just very briefly, Riel is writing about Germany before Bismarck, so it has not been unified yet by force, and so Germany at this time is a sort of confederation, and well, that's an alternative way of doing things. The United States used to be a confederation, but few confederations sadly have survived the modern era.
So this is sort of a comment question, but I'd like to see if Luke and John could address this. So just a couple of kind of, I guess, pushbacks on the ideal of localism, and just see if you have sort of responses to them. On the one hand, localism can be problematic because it's susceptible to the critique of communitarianism, which is that it seems sort of agnostic toward the good, and obviously there's more specific common goods, but there are certainly basic goods, the primary principles derived from the natural law. So to the extent that we say, well, cannibalism for cannibals, let communities do what they want, and different civil society organizations can exist and do their thing, NAMBLA and NARAL, they're okay too, they're just civil society. Ciceronian Society is another version of civil society, and the Satanist church, okay, fine, Methodist church, fine. So we can have kind of a plurality that is sort of agnostic towards the good on the one hand, right? So how would you address the critique of communitarianism with sort of idea that human nature, such as it is, there are certain basic goods. And then on the other hand, so let's say you do have these sort of small platoons, communities that are thriving and doing the right thing. To what extent are they susceptible to the crushing action of state leviathan? Just for example, let's say you have some sort of, Catholic homeschool cooperative that spreads throughout the nation. It's tremendously successful, and a couple million students are thriving in it, and public schools are emptying out, let's just say. And this seems like a great movement coming up from civil society, and we're all applauding it, but it exists at the behest of the liberal state, which can crush it at will. And so it would be, perhaps, right, so they could regulate it out of existence, potentially. So to what extent is it necessary to both bolster local institutions, but also have people acting in the administrative state to protect some of the things started by small platoons? All right, sorry, that's a lot, but I wanted to throw that out there for this Ciceronian Society.
Yes, good. So that's a very good question. I think the kind of core is won't there be limits to what the local communities can do based on natural law or something? And surely the higher community of the state, the bigger one, would be the one to regulate it. And so that would be, I think that would be correct. So Nisbet would agree to a certain extent that there can be interventions from above. So, we're not placing, again, sovereignty with a capital S in any location, including the local community, even though we just praised it. So what Nisbet's, and I'm pushing back against, is we put a sovereignty with a capital S at the top, so we're going to split that up and go down to the local community, but it's not a transference down, and then we get the Satanist church down there with its, child sacrifice. So that critique is fine. And then the other half of it was, we're going to have an administrative state of some sort with regulations of some sort. Don't we want good people there with principles that won't crush the civil society institutions as they're coming up? And that's exactly right. So much of my work is trying to elaborate constitutional protections that would protect civil society institutions, drawing from Robert Nisbet, but then elaborating in the American context towards what that would be. The post-liberals are really kind of sneeringly dismissive of all those sorts of protections. We'll just work through the administrative state and not have these little carve-outs because, you can grow a beard in prison, if you're Muslim. Whippy, but that those carve-outs can protect a vast movement like that. So I published an essay with Heritage Foundation's First Principles series earlier this week, where I give some of these public policy ideas of constitutional protections or legislative protections that would protect just the movement you're talking about. So guidance for our legislatures about what it could tell the administrative state it couldn't do to these groups. Guidance of how we should understand constitutional prescriptions regarding the assembly clause, for example, that would protect precisely the sort of organizations that you're talking about. So I agree. That's, in fact, you kind of plotted the exact question that has to be pursued, that the post-liberals are actually dismissing in their advocacy of the administrative state. They dismiss those sorts of questions. Why would we need a Catholic homeschooling group with millions of people in it when we can just take over the public schools? And I think that exactly what you kind of sketched out is exactly the way of thinking that we'll want to take Nisbet down.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. I mean, I think one thing that's worth clarifying is that when there are the avenues for the higher authority to come down and restrain the state, right, there has to be clarity on when and how that takes place. So, for instance, there's nothing, right, nothing, and I think in either of the kind of views that we were presenting says you can't have a 14th Amendment or something. But the key is, like, you have a 14th Amendment that does say, okay, these are the things, right, these are the criteria, and that amendment gains, right, a consensus in society that this is when we want that higher authority to come in, as opposed to just capital S, the higher authority is the sovereign and it gets to decide, right? That's just a kind of different model. So just clarifying that, you can certainly have, right, a higher authority that then comes in and restrains the lower. But I mean, on the agnosticism towards the good sort of thing, I think that's just like a human problem. I mean, there's the one thing to say we're going to let different civil associations pursue different views of the good, and some of them might not actually be good, and we know that, but we're going to let them do it anyway. But then, if in the pursuit of kind of rigid order and unity or monism, you say, well, no, only the good is going to be allowed. Well, then you run into sorts of things that Luke was saying, with that. You don't know that the good actually will be the one that is the unified authority. So whichever way you go, you run into the problem that not everybody's actually pursuing the good. So you're going to have difficulties. And I think the civil association model is the less dangerous model. It's not the kind of roulette wheel that you just kind of hope it lands on the right space and we get the correct order. So. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Could we please give a round of applause to our panelists? A few final notes on this wonderful conference. I want to again thank Josh Bowman, our vice president, for putting it all together. From Afrofuturism to expressive individualism to German Romanticism, this has been quite a conference. I want to thank all the people who asked questions to help improve the quality of discussion. I want to thank, finally, our sponsors. First and foremost, Belmont Abbey, and for providing us this venue, and especially the Belmont Abbey Honors College. The Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America. Oh, we're just going to, want me to go now? We're done, yeah, let's do the rest. Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the Lumen Christi Institute, Nova Forum for Catholic Thought, and Regent University Honors College. This ends our official program, so all of you are free to go unless you want to eat. No, you're not free to go, Josh. I meant you're free to go. Like, you can get up and eat. Like, oh, you want me to pray? Josh knows that if I'm not given very specific instructions in text 3 times, then I will fall down on the job. So how many mistakes have I made while trying to close this out? I want to thank Josh for showing great restraint and not coming up here and ripping this microphone out of my hands.
There's still time.
I'm not doing that one. I can't live up to the stereotype. Just to shoot that one out real quick while the kids are all screaming. All right, Psalm 112. Or 113. Repent and believe the gospel, says the Lord. Praise servants of the Lord. Praise the name of the Lord. Let the Lord's name be blessed now and forever. From the sun's rising to its setting, the Lord's name is to be praised. The Lord is high over all peoples. His glory is above the heavens. Who is like the Lord our God, who lives on high? Who bends down to watch over heaven and earth? He raises the weak from the ground, the poor from the dunghill, raises them among the princes of his people. He gives the barren woman a household, makes her the happy mother of children. Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. The Lord bless us and keep us from all evil and bring us into everlasting life. Amen. Am I done now? You are free to go with caveats.